Greetings, fellow travelers. In addition to being a certified Forever GM, trademarked, I am also a prolific writer. When I run a TTRPG, the thing that excites me more than anything else is the story, the narrative that me and my players are weaving at the table. So every now and then, when it feels appropriate, I'll sit down and write a quick little short story about one of my games. And then I'll send it off to the players to read, or sometimes I'll hold on to it so I can give it to them later, when the time is right. This is something that I love to do because I enjoy writing, and my players tell me that they love these short stories, but it also lets me do things with the story that I don't think I'd be able to do otherwise. I think little vignettes like these can be a great tool in a GM's arsenal, so I like to spread the good word and talk about why I think you, yes you, should write short stories for your games. I'll even give an example at the end if that piques your interest. First things first. If you want to hear a lot of what I'm about to say from a voice that is a bit more experienced, Matthew Colville has a video titled Lore vs. Writing that, while it is an hour-long ramble, is definitely worth a watch and gives some seriously good advice in kind of the same vein that I'm going for. The link, as always, will be in the description. Wait, hold on, am I contractually obligated to call it the doobly-doo if I'm talking about Colville? Probably. Anyway. Short stories. When I say short stories, I'm talking about little 1 to 5 page write-ups, nothing too extensive or time consuming. Why make them? Why send them to your players for them to read? What's the purpose for doing so? Well, there are a couple. The big draw for me, as someone whose games focus heavily on the narrative, is that in your standard TTRPG session, the camera, so to speak, is pretty static. And when I say the camera, I'm referring to where the focus is. Like if your campaign was a movie or TV show, where is the camera pointing? Almost always at the player characters, right? And obviously that's the point. They are the protagonists and we are creating their story as we play the game. We want the metaphorical camera to be pointed at them pretty much the whole time because that's where the majority of the action is. And because that's what lets people roleplay and have fun. But with the camera being so static, following the PCs wherever they go, it can be hard to do a lot of the things that help us tell interesting stories. Dramatic irony, for example, where the audience is clued into something that the characters aren't, is harder to do during a session. Not impossible, mind, but certainly more difficult by way of the medium that is TTRPGs. This is where short stories can step in and fill that gap. It lets you take the camera and point it elsewhere for a little bit to provide some context that the characters might not stumble across, but that the players should have. There's 1,001 use cases for this. Here, let me list some of them. Want to show what an NPC did before or after the PCs interacted with them? A short story can do that. Want to exposit some lore or backstory that the characters wouldn't know but that you want your players to? A short story can do that. Want to have a conversation between 2 NPCs that would be too cumbersome to do during a session? A short story can do that. Want to explain an NPC's goals or motivations without doing an unnatural feeling monologue about it? Short story. Want to foreshadow potential future plot hooks before they show up in game? Short story. Want to explore an event that happened before the events of the campaign? Short story. These are all things that more traditional storytelling mediums, books, movies, TV shows, etc. are just better equipped to do because they don't have to put 95% of the focus on just the protagonists and what they're doing. Let me just say, I don't want to rag on TTRPGs. Obviously, I love them to death and back. They are great for telling stories, but like any medium, they have their strengths and their weaknesses, and the protag-centric nature of the medium counts very strongly as both. You can tell a great story that never leaves the protagonist's perspective. Life of Pi is an all-time favorite book of mine that does exactly that. But if you want to play around with the story some more, short stories are an easy way of placing the metaphorical camera somewhere else just for a little while. In particular, I find that short stories can really help you flesh out your antagonists, what they're up to, what their motivations are, and how they're reacting to the player characters. I have 2 examples from media for this, one that I think more people will have seen, and one that I think is more illustrative of how I handle short stories in my tabletop games. The former is Kung Fu Panda, specifically the first movie with Tai Lung as the villain. One of my favorite movies of all time, and yet, have you noticed that Po and Tai Lung, the protagonist and main antagonist, don't interact even once before their fight at the end? Sure, Po hears a lot about Tai Lung right up until they meet face to face, but any creative writing 101 student will scream "show don't tell" at you until someone's orifices start bleeding. Let's imagine Po as our PC and Tai Lung as our BBEG. If that were the case and we never left Po's perspective, I don't think the final boss fight would be all that compelling from the player's point of view. The beef between them is a lot more personal for Tai Lung than it is for Po, save for his beating the shit out of Shifu in the Furious 5. The two of them have never met before, and neither knows what the other is capable of except for what they've been told. It could still be a satisfying conclusion to an amazing campaign, but now imagine this. You, the hypothetical GM of this game, turn Tai Lung's prison break sequence into a short story and hand it to Po's player. Really go into detail about how much of a master of martial arts this guy is, how clever and unstoppable he can be. Think about how that would transform the player's understanding of the main villain, how it would make them feel more like a real threat. Po, the character, doesn't get to see any of this, but we, the audience, do, and when you are running an RPG, the players are the audience. So yeah, I think letting the players get a peek at what else is going on in the world outside of what their characters experience can really help make the narrative all the more impactful. My second example is the Netflix Castlevania show, seasons 1 and 2 specifically. Our protags, or player characters in this analogy, Trevor, Alucard, and Sypha, spend the better part of 2 seasons preparing for and making their way to the fight with Dracula, and about 10 minutes actually interacting with him. Their beef with him is quite a bit more personal, especially Alucard and to a lesser extent Trevor, but they don't get to see much of what he's actually doing. But we sure as hell do. Dracula is our main villain and sort of a deuteragonist. He basically gets half the screen time in the first 2 seasons. I think if I were to rip off the Castlevania show and run it as a tabletop game, something I have considered doing many times, I'd turn a lot of Dracula's scenes into short stories. He just has so much going on that our protagonists don't get to see, but that the story would not be the same without. Dracula only dies the way he does because of all his emotional turmoil that's going on underneath the surface. The despondency, the self-hatred, the death wish that he has, it all culminates in this beautiful, tragic moment where Alucard stakes him through the heart. And all of that would be lost if the camera was glued to our 3 heroes and we never got to see or hear from Dracula until the moment him and Alucard start having a philosophical battle over the best way to avenge Lisa. So, if we want to show our players things that their characters can't see or don't know, why do short stories in particular work so well for that? Well, because if you are a GM, especially a narrative-focused one, you are a writer. You may not think of yourself in that way, but I assure you, you are. Making characters, describing places and actions and entire scenes, telling a story at the table, that is writing. And while sitting down and banging out a couple hundred words about what the BBG is up to, or whatever your short story is about, is definitely different from running the game live and can be a little daunting if you aren't used to it, I promise it is not as scary as you may think it is. Writing also lets you exercise a lot of control over what exactly happens. One of my favorite parts about TTRPGs is that they are live, improvised, kinda unpredictable. You can set up a scene and flesh out the NPCs as best you can, but the moment all that planning comes into contact with your players, there's no telling what can happen. So, if you want to demonstrate something very specific that might not come up naturally during play, you could put it in a short story, so that you don't have to trample over what your players are doing just to get a plot point across. And, in my personal experience, writing really helps me get a better grasp on who my NPCs are as people. How they present in front of the player characters is one thing. Castlevania's Dracula is about 80% depression by volume, but the protags mostly get to see him angrily beating their asses and not much else. So showing them when they've got other things going on can give you a new angle from which to look at them. It makes them more well-rounded, which gives you more to play with and helps sell your players on them as characters too. Now, how to actually go about making a short story? Well, I hate to be unhelpful, but it really does depend on your group, your table, your game, and your story. I can tell you what I do, and again, I have an example in store for later, but take what works and leave what doesn't. I think the important thing is, before you even start writing, have a strong idea of what the story is about. What needs to be said or done, who is involved, when does it take place, how does it relate to the overarching narrative broadly, and the PC specifically, all of that good stuff. My worst short stories are consistently the ones where I don't really know where I'm going with them. They need to have some sort of a point or purpose, otherwise they're just fluff. Hell, maybe the point is to be just fluff, but it's better to intend that going in than to wind up there because you wrote a short story just because. It's also critical to have a standard for what necessitates a short story, which is to say, don't overdo it. I mean, if your players love reading a short story after every session, go wild, but typically that isn't the case. So, I tend to be pretty judicious with what I write short stories about. I think a good rule of thumb is asking, does this short story improve the narrative? And that can mean a lot of different things. Again, depending on your specific situation, your mileage may vary. Not every little conversation the villains have needs to be its own thing, because it might get a little tedious for your players to try and keep up. Less really can be more if you only write about what has the most impact and significance. And remember, TTRPGs are collaborative. Sure, you as the GM may know what is going on behind the scenes, but you don't want to overwrite what the players have accomplished. If anything, short stories are best received when they take the PC's actions into account, showing the consequences, positive and negative, of those actions. One of the first short stories I ever wrote for a game of mine was basically just the at the time main villain ruminating over how badly the party had ruined his plans, and the group loved it. I think this is actually one of the most effective uses for short stories in TTRPGs, exploring the impact that the player characters have on the world and the people around them. For my last piece of advice, I say keep it short and sweet. Again, if your players want to read a novel, don't let me be the one to tell you not to write it. But the actual game is still the narrative's main vector. Short stories are supplemental, they shouldn't steal the show, and if at all possible, reading them shouldn't be necessary for a player to still enjoy what's happening at the table. It's easy to get caught up in the desire to explore every nook and cranny of your story once you start writing these vignettes and whatnot, but don't lose the forest for the trees. Keep your focus on the player's story, not just yours. Alright, I believe that's everything I have to say out of the way. Now, onto the long-awaited example, a little short story I wrote called Counsel. To briefly provide a little context, this story centers around an NPC named Persephone, who is about as close as you can get to a deuteragonist for being an NPC. This story takes place after the party located a woman named Sophoclea, who Persephone was looking for so that she could learn more about her mother Selene. I'll put more context on screen as I'm reading if you'd like to pause and read that. But without further ado, here we go. At first, Persephone was wary of the 4 adventurers who'd turned up at her room offering to help her find the one woman who could answer all her deepest questions. She decided to give them a chance, because everyone deserves a first chance at least, if not a second, and a week later, it paid off. Sophoclea had fled to, of all places, a small farming town in the swampy, unseelie Strand, just 5 days' walk from Crown Asari. It was not a difficult decision to pack her things and head out immediately. And now she sat in Sophoclea's common room, holding a warm cup of tea in her hands. Persephone cleared her throat and nervously said, "Thank you again for having me, Miss Vasile." Sophoclea chuckled in response. "Don't mention it, child, and you can call me by my name, I'm not your tutor." The hearty grin on her face made Persephone ease up a little, as she tried to relax in the comfortable armchair she was seated in. When Sophoclea took a seat, her own drink in hand, Persephone spoke up. "So, Sophoclea, I have so many questions." "I figured you would," the older nymph replied, punctuating her sentence with a sip. "By all means, ask away." Persephone nodded and pondered for a moment, staring into her tea as if the leaves would give her the answer she sought. "First, what was my mother like?" To walk the halls of the Demonax domain was one thing. To stand in its throne room, the literal seat of power for the Court of Gloom, was another. Great arches of dark gray stone, lined with obsidian accents, held the ceiling aloft. A dozen or more silver chandeliers filled the room with the dim glow of 100 magical candles, each one enchanted to never burn out. The walls were lined with the treasures of ancient conquests, but perhaps the greatest treasure of all was the throne. As old as House Demonax itself, it was wrought from black marble, each intricate detail hand-carved over 1,000 years ago. Once upon a time, Tarchon Demonax would have sat upon it, and the room would be packed with generals and aristocrats, all vying to earn his favor. But it was Selene who sat upon it today, and the space that stretched out before her was empty. Empty, save for the loyal advisor who remained by her side, even as the gates of her city had been breached. Empty, save for Sophoclea Vasile. "If he comes for you," she pleaded, "he will kill you. You need to run, my lady." Celine's expression was inscrutable and unchanging as she spoke. Tarkon did not run from Apollyon's challenge. He risked his life to save this very city. With a flick of her wrist and a whisper on her lips, she called Dory Diamond to her. The spear simply appeared in her open hand, and she grasped it tightly. I will do the same. Sophocleia stared at her incredulously. And what will you tell Charon when you need passage to his realm? The consul didn't meet her gaze, instead silently staring forward for a moment. A good leader doesn't flee when the enemy's blade comes for their neck. It is the good leader that stays, fights, and bears the consequences. Now Celine turned to face her advisor, and the two locked eyes. That is what I will tell him. Your mother was a good leader. Headstrong, that's for certain. But she cared for her people, deeply and personally. As she gave her answer, Sophocleia stared off into the middle distance. The memories were decades distant, yet she could call them to mind as if they were just weeks old. Persephone nodded along. Veal told me that he was the only person that could get through to her when her mind was made up. He's not wrong. Sophocleia laughed, but her humor was tinged with a trace of sadness as it faded into silence. I often wonder how things might have gone different if he was with her when she died, and not me. The young nymph uncomfortably shifted at the mention of her mother's death. Speaking of, she began anxiously, what happened? Celine! Isidoros' voice echoed through the stone chamber, wresting the attention of both the consul and her advisor. With bated breath, Sophocleia glanced at Celine, only to see that she had not moved an inch at his intrusion. The time has come, she said in a low whisper, so quiet the person beside her could barely make out the words. It was only then that she stood. If you're not going to flee, at least let me fight with you. Sophocleia raised her hand and invoked the power of Charon's lantern, causing a purple flame to ignite in her very palm. Wordlessly, Celine strode down the steps that approached her throne, and her advisor followed closely behind. The consul took her spear in two hands and made a swift slicing motion in front of her. Where the tip of Dory Diamond met the air, a tear appeared, a lightless black rift with edges of shimmering violet energy. Sophocleia voiced her confusion. I thought you wanted to stay and fight. Celine turned to her. For the first time in hours, a slight smile spread across her face, even as tears welled up in her eyes. Gently placing a hand on Sophocleia's shoulder, she said, Dawn comes for us now, but we will have our dusk. And before Sophocleia could respond, Celine pushed her through the rift. A heavy sigh escaped Sophocleia. Isidoros came for her, and, well, I tried to get her to flee. She wouldn't accept that. When I offered to at least stand with her, she didn't accept that either. Emotions overtook her for a brief moment, but she forged ahead. I wasn't there to see what actually happened, but I felt her death. Persephone cocked her head to the side. You two had a fairy bond? Sophocleia nodded. We were close. I think I was a comfort and presence to her, after Veal left to raise you in secret. Just then, Persephone felt a sharp pain in her mind, as though someone had driven a cold iron spike into her skull. She dropped her teacup, sending the drink onto the floor as she clutched the sides of her head. A voice broke through the din of her scattered thoughts. Hellion, have you completed your mission? Immediately, Persephone stood. I have to go. She started towards the door. You alright, kid? Sophocleia asked. Her soft tone of voice made Persephone stop dead in her tracks. She was hesitant in her response. Yeah, just forgot something. She took in a breath, then let it out to calm herself. I'll be back. One day, probably. Don't know when. If that's okay. Of course. You're welcome here anytime. Sophocleia put a hand on her back. Persephone mustered up the best smile she could before turning the handle and walking out the door, making sure to shut it behind her. It took her several seconds to compose herself before replying to Sharp. She closed her eyes and directed her thoughts to them. I wasn't at the second Congress. Sharp's response came quick. Wonderful. Our one chance to catch the Elder out in the open, and you squandered it. Persephone heard them sigh. Night manga still needs attending to, so make your way to Dreaming Shore. Do not disobey me this time. Man, sometimes I get chills reading some of these short stories, and I'm the person who wrote them. Anyway, allow me to explain what the purpose of this short story is. Or rather, the purposes, because there are several. First and foremost, Celine is a character who is A, incredibly important, and B, incredibly dead, so Sophoclea's flashbacks are to give her some post-mortem characterization. The events depicted take place about 20 years before the start of the campaign, so was kind of my only option. Second, as I mentioned, the party went looking for Sophoclea specifically for Persephone, but they never got the chance to see what came of that, so I wanted to give them that chance. Third, Persephone's relationship with Sharp, the person talking to her at the end there, is pretty important too, seeing as they are a major villain in this campaign that the party wants to help Persephone separate herself from. So, all in all, this short story had a lot of heavy lifting to do, and only 3 pages to do it in, but I'm really proud of how it turned out. And my players liked it, so I hope what I've said has inspired you to give short stories a shot. I really think they can elevate your tabletop games when done well. They might not be for every table or every game, but I enjoy writing them, my players enjoy reading them, and I know we're not the only ones. So, if you like the sound of it, give it a try. You might be surprised by how well it works. If you enjoyed this video and want to stick around, you know what buttons to press to make that happen. Until next we meet, farewell, fellow travelers.